My grandfather was the most religious man I have ever known. He woke at 5 a.m. every morning, long before the sun could paint the sky over our town, before the birds began their hesitant chorus, before anyone else in our large family home even stirred in their beds, and I would lie in my own small room on the second floor listening to the familiar sounds that marked the beginning of his day. The soft rustle of his cotton kurta as he dressed in the dark, the careful creak of the wooden stairs that had groaned under his feet for 40 years, the gentle splash of water in the courtyard as he performed his ritual washing before prayer, and then his voice would rise, deep and steady and beautiful, filling the house with words I didn't understand but somehow knew were holy, a private conversation between him and the God he loved so completely that I was privileged to overhear from my bedroom. And sometimes I would creep to the top of the stairs and watch him through the wooden rails, his body moving through the familiar positions, standing, bowing, prostrating, sitting, with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, his lips moving constantly, whispering verses I would later learn to recite myself, his forehead touching the ground with each prostration while I counted the seconds he remained there, lost in communion with something greater than any of us, and by the time I finally made my way downstairs, dressed for school and still yawning, he would be finished with his prayers and sitting on his favorite cushion near the kitchen, waiting for me with a plate of warm paratha fresh from the griddle, sometimes with butter melting into the layers, sometimes with sugar sprinkled on top because he knew that was my favorite, and he would pull me onto his lap despite the fact that I was getting too big for such things and feed me with his own hands, breaking the paratha into small pieces and placing them in my mouth like I was still a baby, saying, "Come, beta, eat, grow strong, be a good man today." And then he would look at me with those soft eyes full of love and say, "Always tell the truth, beta, always be honest, always be kind. A man is nothing without his word. If people cannot trust you, you have nothing." And I believed him completely because that's what children do. They believe the people who love them. They believe the way children believe the sun will rise. Without question. Without evidence. Without any concept of an alternative. And I had no idea at all, that this man who prayed every morning, who read scripture with tears in his eyes, who fed me warm bread with his own hands and told me to be good, was not the man I thought he was. Here's what I knew about my grandfather's work. He had a shop, that's what everyone called it, grandfather's shop, and when relatives asked how he was they would say, "How is business at the shop?" And when neighbors needed advice they would go to the shop to find him, and when important men came to visit our home, men in clean clothes with serious faces, men who arrived in cars that cost more than most people earned in a year, they would sit with my grandfather in his private room and talk about the shop for hours, their voices low and urgent, emerging only when the tea had gone cold and the shadows had lengthened, and I was 6 years old the first and only time I ever went there, when my father took me one afternoon, a rare treat, and we drove away from the crowded streets of our neighborhood, past the bazaar with its noise and color, past the schools and temples, out toward an area I didn't recognize where the buildings became larger and more industrial and the air smelled different, sharp, chemical, unfamiliar, and my father's hands tightened on the steering wheel as we drove, his jaw set in that way I would later learn meant he was thinking about things he didn't want to think about, carrying weights he didn't want to carry, and he said, "We won't stay long, just say hello to your grandfather and then we'll go, don't wander off. Don't touch anything, stay close to me," and the shop was a large building with a heavy metal door and no windows, surrounded by a high wall topped with barbed wire, and men sat outside on wooden benches drinking tea from small clay cups, speaking in voices so low I couldn't hear them even as we passed, and they stopped talking when we approached, every single one of them falling silent and turning to look at me. A small boy in school uniform holding his father's hand, and their faces did something complicated. Recognition, yes, but also something else, something I couldn't name at 6 years old but would recognize later as a kind of wary respect, the look men give to someone who belongs to power even if they don't possess it themselves, and one of them said, "The lion's cub has come," and the others nodded and went back to their tea, and inside the building was dim and cool after the bright heat outside. And there was a heavy wooden desk, old and scarred, covered with papers and ledgers and a telephone that looked like it cost more than our car, and behind it sat my grandfather, looking different here, not less loving, but more serious, more focused, more like the men who came to our house for meetings, and an ancient scale sat on one corner of his desk, the kind with 2 brass plates and a chain, and men sat on the floor along the walls, leaning against cushions, smoking cigarettes and watching. Everything with sharp eyes, and when I walked in with my father they all looked at me, and for just a second the room went completely silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop its lazy rotation, and then my grandfather smiled and the room breathed again, and he rose from his chair and came around the desk and lifted me in his arms and held me close, and I buried my face in his neck, breathing in his familiar smell of soap and wool and the faint trace of a sweet sickly thing that clung to his clothes and skin. And on the way home I asked my father, "What does grandfather sell?" And he looked at the road ahead with white knuckles on the steering wheel and said, "Everything, he sells everything." And I said, "But what is everything?" And after a long pause he said, "Don't ask too many questions, it's not polite." And that was my first lesson in how our family worked. Questions were not polite, curiosity was not encouraged. The spaces between words were where the real conversations happened, and if you couldn't hear what wasn't being said, that was your own fault. We were not poor, we were comfortable in a way that most people around us were not, in a way that set us apart without anyone ever saying it out loud, with a 2-story house when most neighbors had 1 story, a car when most took rickshaws or buses or walked, a television when television was still a luxury, foreign chocolates in the fridge that cost more than a day's wages for the man who polished our shoes, clothes from other countries, books in English, private school, private tutors, cricket coaching, the best doctors when anyone got sick, and my mother would touch her forehead to the floor in thanks after her own prayers and say, "We are blessed, God has been kind," without ever specifying what exactly God had been kind about, because the blessing was the money itself, the comfort itself, the life we had that others didn't, and the source of the money was not a topic for conversation, not something you examined too closely, like the foundations of a house you preferred not to think about. And I remember when I was 11 or 12 overhearing my aunt whisper to my mother in the kitchen. They thought I was in my room, but I had come down for water and stopped outside the door when I heard my name, and my aunt whispered, "The police came to the shop again," and I froze, because even at that age the word police carried weight, danger, trouble, things that happened to other families, not ours. And my mother's hand, which had been chopping vegetables, paused for just a moment, the knife hanging in the air above a partially cut onion, and then she resumed faster, the knife making sharp decisive sounds against the cutting board, and she said, "Your brother-in-law handles all that, it's not our concern." And my aunt said, "But if something happens?" And my mother said, "Nothing will happen, nothing has happened for 20 years, nothing will happen now. We don't talk about these things." And my aunt said, "But the children, they hear things, they see things." And my mother's voice was final as she said, "The children are children, they don't need to know anything, they go to school, they eat well, they have good clothes, they have a future, that's all they need to know." And I crept back upstairs, my heart pounding though I couldn't have said why, and went back to my video game and forgot about it, or told myself I forgot, because that was the family way. If you didn't say it out loud, maybe it wasn't really happening. If you didn't ask questions, maybe you wouldn't get answers you didn't want. If you just kept living your comfortable life, maybe the comfortable life would continue forever. Looking back now with the cruel clarity of adulthood, I realize how many signs I missed. The way relatives would lower their voices when I walked into a room, the way conversations would stop mid-sentence and then resume awkwardly about completely different topics. The way my grandmother would sometimes cry at night thinking no one could hear, and my grandfather would sit beside her silent, not comforting, just present, as if her tears were a debt he had to pay. The way certain family members were never mentioned, uncles who had moved away suddenly years ago to cities no one could quite name, cousins who had stopped speaking to us, old photographs with people cut out of them, missing faces that someone had decided should no longer exist in our memory. But the thing I couldn't miss, the thing I couldn't ignore or explain away or forget no matter how hard I tried, was the way my father left our country when I was 14, sitting me down in our living room one evening and telling me he was moving to America, to New Jersey, for opportunities, to build something for us, to send for me and my mother once he was settled. And when I asked how long, he said a year, maybe 2, and when I asked why he had to go so far, he said, "Sometimes a man has to go far away to give his family a better life. Sometimes the past is too heavy here, sometimes you need to start fresh somewhere new, and I didn't understand then. I thought he meant the economy, the opportunities, the American dream I'd heard about on television. I didn't understand that he meant something else entirely, and my mother smiled when she told me how proud I should be of him. That smile that doesn't reach your eyes, that covers something else, fear maybe, or sadness or grief. And she hugged me tight and said we would be fine, we were strong, this was for the best. And for 2 years my father was a voice on the phone, a signature on letters, a face on crackling video calls once a month, pixelated and frozen, his words arriving seconds after his lips moved so that we were always slightly out of sync. Sending money and photos of snow and American chocolates that tasted different from the foreign chocolates in our fridge, sharper and sweeter, like a country that knew it was the center of the world and expected you to be grateful for the privilege of tasting its candy. And then when I was 16 he sent for us, and my mother and I packed our lives into 6 suitcases and said goodbye to grandparents who held us too tight and too long and wept without shame and made us promise to call to visit to never forget. And my grandfather hugged me last, his eyes wet, and whispered in my ear in a voice so low only I could hear, "Be good, Beta. Be a good man, that's all I ever wanted for you, that's all that matters." And we boarded a plane, and 14 hours later we landed in a country where my grandfather's name meant nothing, where no one lowered their voices when we walked into a room, where the past could be left behind like old luggage at the carousel, or so I thought. America was disorienting, the food different, everything wrapped in plastic with expiration dates and nutrition labels and ingredients I couldn't pronounce, the language the same but different with accents I had to learn to understand and slang that made no sense and references to TV shows I'd never seen and celebrities I'd never heard of. The way people looked at you not with suspicion exactly but with a kind of cheerful incomprehension as if you were a puzzle they couldn't quite solve, asking, "Where are you from?" And when I told them nodding and saying, "Oh cool," and then having nothing else to add. And I threw myself into becoming American, learned the slang, lost my accent practicing in front of the mirror for hours until my vowels flattened and my R's softened, ate pizza with my hands and argued about baseball and pretended with all the fervor of a teenager desperate to belong that America had always been my home, while my father worked long hours at his distribution business. Something involving trucks and warehouses and clients I never met, leaving before I woke up and coming home after I'd gone to bed, sitting in his armchair on weekends watching American news with that same expression I remembered from years ago, knuckles white on the armrests, jaw tight, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, something that wasn't on the screen. And sometimes I would sit with him and we would watch together in silence, me wanting to ask questions about his work, about our family, about why we really left, about the shadows I sometimes saw in his eyes, but I had learned long ago that questions were not polite, were not welcome, were not answered, so we sat in silence, father and son, watching images of a country that wasn't ours flash across the screen while the real questions hung unasked in the air between us. And when I asked my mother once what was wrong with him, she said, "He carries the world on his shoulders, like his father before him." And when I asked if grandfather was like that, carrying the world, she paused, a shirt halfway folded, and said, "Yes, in his own way." And when I asked what he carried, she resumed folding and said, "Things you don't need to know about, things that are over and done, the past is the past." And I didn't ask what that meant because by then I had mastered the family habit of not asking. The past was the past and we were in America now, and that was supposed to be enough. College changed me, not because of the classes, though I took plenty of those, not because of the friends, though I made plenty of those too, not because I discovered parties or drinking or any of the other things parents worry about, but because college taught me something my family never had, how to ask questions. And in my sophomore year I took a history course with a professor from another country, sharp and funny and brilliant, with a gift for making the past feel urgent and present, talking about how history isn't just dates and events but stories, stories of ordinary people, families, secrets, lives, and how every family has a history, and understanding that history is the first step to understanding yourself. And one day after class I stayed behind to ask her about something she'd mentioned, and she said, "You know, your family might have stories like that, everyone does, ask your grandparents next time you call home." And I laughed nervously and said, "My grandparents don't really talk about the past." And she looked at me for a long moment, her head tilted, her eyes sharp and knowing, and said, "Don't they? Or don't you ask?" And that question hit me like a physical blow. Don't they or don't you ask? And that night I called my mother and said, "What did grandfather do before he retired? what was his business? And there was a pause, the kind of pause I remembered from childhood, heavy with things unsaid, weighted with decades of silence. And she said, he was a merchant, he sold things. And I said, what kind of things? And she said, why are you asking this now? You never asked before. And I said, I'm asking now. What did he sell? And after another pause, longer this time, her voice smaller, like a child who has been caught at something, she said, medicine. He sold medicine. And the word hung in the air between us, transmitted across thousands of miles of fiber optic cable, across oceans and continents and years of silence. And I said, that's good, medicine helps people. And she said quickly, too quickly, yes, it helps people. Now how are your classes? Have you been eating properly? Are you getting enough sleep? And she changed the subject and I let her, but something had shifted, something felt wrong, because medicine didn't fit. It didn't fit the whispers and the police visits and the way my father left our country and never looked back. It didn't explain the men on wooden benches or the sudden silences or the weight my father carried on his shoulders, even now thousands of miles away from whatever had put it there. And I didn't believe her, not because I thought she was lying. My mother didn't lie, not to me, not ever, not about anything important. But because medicine was too simple, too clean, too easy. It was the answer you give when you don't want to give the real answer, the story you tell when the true story is too complicated, too painful, too dangerous to say out loud. And there was something she wasn't telling me, something she thought I didn't need to know, something she hoped I would never find out. I didn't believe her, so I did what any college student in 2018 would do. I Googled, and my grandfather's name was uncommon enough that I found him immediately. The first result, a newspaper article from 1987 with a headline in the language of my home country that I could read well enough to understand. Drug kingpin arrested in major raid. And I stared at the screen, the words not making sense. Reading them again and again. Kingpin arrested, drugs, not medicine, drugs. And I clicked on the article and there was a photo, grainy and black and white, scanned from a physical newspaper that had been printed before I was born, but unmistakably him, my grandfather, the man who prayed every morning, the man who fed me warm bread with his own hands, the man who told me to always be good, always be honest, always tell the truth, standing in handcuffs being led into a police van by men in uniform. And the article said he ran one of the largest narcotics operations in the region, his network stretching across multiple cities, across borders, across the invisible lines that separated countries and economies and lives, that he had been evading arrest for years, hiding in plain sight as a respectable businessman with a secret empire built on the suffering of others, on addiction and misery and death, that he was released on bail after 6 months and the case was still pending. And I closed my laptop and walked to the bathroom and vomited, and then I stood at the sink splashing cold water on my face, looking at myself in the mirror. Same face, same eyes, same person I'd been an hour ago, but everything was different, everything had changed. The man I loved, the man I admired, the man I wanted to be like was a criminal, a drug dealer, a kingpin, the source of our comfort, our education, our chocolates and clothes and private tutors. The money that had paid for everything good in my childhood was all built on poison, on the destruction of other people's lives, on the suffering of children like me, in families like mine who didn't have the protection of a grandfather who could buy their way out of anything. And I thought about the men in his shop who called me lion's cub, the police visits, the whispered conversations, the relatives who stopped speaking to us, my father's white knuckles on the steering wheel, my grandmother's nighttime tears, my mother's careful silences, the way my father had left our country and never looked back, the way he carried something invisible on his shoulders. The way he couldn't meet my eyes when I asked the wrong questions, and it all made sense now, every piece of the puzzle clicking into place with a sickening finality, a clarity that was worse than confusion, because now I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unknow it, couldn't go back to the innocent child I'd been before. I was the grandson of a drug dealer and I had never known. I called my father that night at 2 a.m. on the East Coast, which meant it was late morning where he was, and he answered on the second ring, and I said, I know, and he said, know what? And I said, about grandfather, about what he did. I found articles from 1987, and there was a long silence. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, could hear the distant sounds of his office phones ringing, people talking, the hum of American commerce continuing around him while his world stopped. And when he spoke, his voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days, and he said, your grandfather was a complicated man. And I said, he was a drug dealer. And he said, he was my father. And I said, that's not. And he said, He was my father, and he was a good father to me, and he was a good grandfather to you, and he made choices that I don't understand and can't defend, but he was also the man who paid for your school, who held you when you were sick, who—" And I said, "He was a criminal, and—" His voice cracked as he said, "Yes, he was, and I have spent my entire life running from that. I came here so you wouldn't have to carry this, so you could be something else, someone else." And I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And he said, "Because I wanted you to love him, because I wanted you to have a grandfather, not a headline, because I thought—" And he stopped, and when he spoke again his voice was barely a whisper. "I thought if I never said it out loud, maybe it wouldn't be true, maybe I could outrun it, maybe you could outrun it. Maybe we could both just be Americans, be new, be clean." And I wanted to be angry, wanted to scream at him, demand explanations, make him answer for every lie of omission, every silence, every moment I'd spent loving a man I didn't really know. But his voice, that broken whisper, that confession of a lifetime of running, stopped me, and I said, "Does he know that I know?" And he said, "Not from me. I never told him I told you. I never told him anything. I don't think he wanted to know. I think he hoped you would just remember him the way you did when you were little, before any of this mattered." And I said, "Does Mom know?" And he said, "She knows everything. She always has. We both decided when you were born that you would have a different life, a clean life, no secrets, no shadows. We thought if we just didn't talk about it, if we just put it behind us and never looked back, it would go away." And I said, "It didn't go away." And he said quietly, "No, it doesn't go away. It never goes away." For weeks I couldn't think about anything else. I googled obsessively, staying up until March 4th 5 a.m., clicking through article after article, following links, reading comments, finding mentions of my grandfather's name in places I never expected, more articles, more details, more evidence of a life I hadn't known existed. My grandfather arrested 3 times, though only convicted once, and that conviction overturned on appeal because of procedural errors. That probably meant someone was paid off, linked to at least 2 murders, though nothing ever proven. Though witnesses had a habit of disappearing before they could testify, an empire built on the suffering of others, and then he came home every night to pray, and I couldn't reconcile it, couldn't hold 2 truths in my head at once: that the man who taught me to be good was bad, that the hands that fed me were dirty, that the love I felt was real, but the person I loved was not who I thought they were. And I stopped calling home, stopped answering my mother's texts, stopped thinking of myself as someone with a family, because family meant complicity, and complicity meant guilt, and guilt meant I was no better than him, until my roommate found me crying in our dorm one night, and I told him everything, the whole story from the beginning, and he listened without interrupting, without judging, just sitting there on the edge of my bed while I spilled out years of secrets and confusion and pain. And when I finally stopped, exhausted and empty, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I'll never forget: "Your grandfather's choices aren't yours. You don't inherit sin, you inherit stories. What you do with them is up to you." Such simple words, such obvious words, but somehow hearing them from someone outside my family, someone with no stake in the story, someone who could see it clearly because he wasn't trapped inside it, made them real. I didn't inherit sin, I inherited a story. A complicated, painful, shameful story, but a story I could choose what to do with. I went back to my home country the summer after junior year, first time in almost a decade, the plane landing in the middle of the night, and by the time I made my way through the chaotic airport and found a taxi willing to take me to my family's neighborhood, dawn was breaking over the city, the streets both familiar and foreign. The same buildings, the same smells of spices and exhaust and open drains, the same chaos of traffic and people and animals, but viewed through different eyes, older eyes, wiser eyes, eyes that had seen too much. And my grandfather was 83 now, frail and stooped, his voice reduced to a whisper, his body diminished by age in a way that seemed impossible for the man I remembered, sitting in the same courtyard where he'd once prayed, wrapped in a blanket despite the heat, watching the world with eyes that had seen too much. And he knew that I knew. Someone must have told him. Maybe my father, maybe my mother, maybe he just saw it in my face when I walked through the gate. Because when I entered the courtyard he looked at me for a long moment, and then he held out his hand and I took it, and he said, "Beta, sit with me," and I sat. And for an hour we didn't speak as the sun moved across the courtyard, burning off the morning coolness, painting the walls with light, while a goat bleated somewhere nearby and children played in the street, their laughter floating over the wall like music from another world where children could be children without carrying the weight of their family's past. and finally without looking at me he spoke and said, "I was not always a good man, I did things that shame me, things I cannot undo, things I have prayed to be forgiven for every day for 40 years, and I said nothing." And he said, "When your father was born I made a choice, I decided he would have a different life, I sent him away. I sent him so far from me that my sins couldn't reach him, and I said, but they did, they reached me." And he closed his eyes and a tear escaped, tracing a path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek, catching in the white stubble of his beard, and another followed, and another, and he whispered, "Yes, they reached you, and I am sorry, I am so sorry," and I wanted to be angry, wanted to scream at him, demand explanations, make him answer for every life he'd damaged, every family he'd destroyed, every young person who'd gotten hooked on the poison he sold. Wanted to tell him that sorry wasn't enough. Could never be enough, that 40 years of prayers couldn't undo 40 years of harm, but sitting there holding his hand watching an old man cry I couldn't. The anger was there burning in my chest, but so was something else, something softer, something that remembered being 7 years old and eating warm bread on his lap, something that remembered how safe I felt in his presence, how loved, how cherished, and I said, "I don't forgive you, not yet. Maybe not ever," and he nodded, eyes still closed, tears still falling, and I said, "But I'm here, I came back," and he whispered, "Thank you, thank you." My grandfather died 2 years later and I didn't go to the funeral. I couldn't. I told myself it was because of work, because of school, because the flights were too expensive and the timing was bad. Told myself funerals were for the living, not the dead, and that I didn't need to stand over his grave to say goodbye. Told myself a lot of things, but the truth was simpler and harder. I didn't know how to stand at his grave and mourn a man I was still trying to understand, didn't know how to grieve someone I was still angry at, still confused by, still wrestling within my own mind, didn't know how to say goodbye to a grandfather who was also a criminal, a loving man who had done unforgivable things, and my father went and called me afterward, his voice thick with tears and something else, relief maybe, that a long chapter was finally closed, that the man who had loomed over his entire life was finally gone, and he said, he asked about you at the end, he wanted you to know that he loved you, that he was proud of you, that he hoped you would be happy. That was all he talked about the last few days, you, your mother, me, never himself, never the past, just us, and I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and in the years since I've thought about him often, some days missing him so much it hurts, the weight of his hand on my head, the sound of his voice in the morning, the way he said my name like it was something precious. Missing the grandfather I thought I had, the one who existed in my childhood memories before the truth came out, the one who was simple and good and uncomplicated. Other days furious, thinking about the lives he damaged, the families he destroyed, the suffering he caused, thinking about how he could pray every day and still do what he did. The hypocrisy, the double life, the lies that shaped my family for generations, the weight my father carried, the silence my mother maintained, the childhood I spent in ignorance while other children paid the price for my grandfather's empire. Other days just tired of carrying this weight, tired of wondering who I am in relation to him, tired of the questions that have no answers, tired of the anger that doesn't change anything, the grief that doesn't bring anyone back, the confusion that never seems to resolve. I still live in America, I have a job, an apartment, a life that looks from the outside completely normal. And my friends don't know about my grandfather, my girlfriend doesn't know. When they ask about my family I tell them the safe parts. My parents came here for opportunity, we're close, everything is fine. I don't mention the newspaper articles, the handcuffs, the secrets. I don't mention the guilt I still carry, the questions I still can't answer, the legacy I still don't know how to handle. Sometimes I think about telling them. Imagine sitting my girlfriend down and saying, "There's something you should know about my family." Imagine her face as I explain the questions she might ask, the way she might look at me differently afterward. Imagine her trying to be supportive, trying to understand, but always looking at me just a little bit differently. And then I think, why carry this weight into another relationship, another decade, another version of myself? Why make her carry it too? Why risk losing someone I love because of something I had no control over, something that happened before I was born? But the weight is there whether I carry it alone or not. That's the thing about secrets. They don't go away just because you don't say them out loud. They live in you, become part of you, shape everything you do and don't do. They affect your relationships even when you don't talk about them. Because they affect you and you bring yourself to every relationship you have. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what makes a person good. My grandfather was a criminal, he did terrible things, unforgivable things, and he also loved me truly and deeply in the only way he knew how. Both of those things are true. My father ran from his past, built a new life in a new country and never looked back. And he also carried that past with him every single day, in the silences, in the white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, in the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes when I asked questions he couldn't answer. Both of those things are true. I am the grandson of a drug dealer, and I am also someone who tries every day to be good, to tell the truth, to ask the hard questions, to break the cycle of silence that defined my childhood. Both of those things are true. And here's what I've learned. People are not simple. We are not heroes or villains, saints or sinners. We are messy, contradictory, impossible creatures capable of great love and great harm, often at the same time, often in the same relationship, often within the same hour. And my grandfather taught me that, not because he wanted to, not because he was trying to teach me anything, but because he was who he was. And I don't know if I forgive him, I don't know if I ever will, but I understand him a little, and understanding, I'm learning, is its own kind of forgiveness. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that 7-year-old boy sitting on his grandfather's lap eating warm bread in the morning light, and I think about what I would tell him if I could go back through time and sit beside that innocent child, if I could warn him about what was coming, prepare him for the truth he would eventually discover. And I would tell him, your grandfather loves you, hold on to that, hold on to it even when you learn things that make you question everything. Because love and truth are not opposites, because people are not one thing, because you will spend your whole life trying to understand, and that's okay, that's human. And I would tell him, one day you'll be someone's grandfather and you'll have a choice. You can carry the silence forward or you can break it. You can let the past define you or you can decide every single day who you want to be. And I would tell him, the lion's cub doesn't have to become a lion. And then I would hug him, that little boy who is and isn't me, and I would let him go back to his grandfather's lap, back to the warmth and the love and the innocence that can't last but is precious while it does, because that's the thing about family secrets. They hurt, they change you, they shape who you become, but they don't have to be the end of the story. The story keeps going, we keep going, and what we do with what we've learned, that's what matters most.